Coventry. It is a city we both have forged our very own connection to, either through university
or birthright. Many regard it as having lost its history in the city's flattening during the Blitz, but we never saw it that way.
To us, it was merely lost, forgotten, and that's when we came across this opportunity of the Priory Undercroft, ruins of Coventry's first great cathedral, an opportunity to resurrect its history, both physically and in memory. When we first came here to the Priory Undercroft, we saw merely a small ruins, but we understood that potential lay deeper. The story we uncovered in our journey to understand these ruins is truly one of wonder.
History hides its secrets well. Even the greatest achievements have been forgotten to time, as Coventry proved, letting nearly 500 years pass over the forgotten ruins of this once important site.
Surviving Vikings, wars and abandonment of his own people, this building still stands alongside you, granted only partially. This site could be traced back 1300 years to a nunnery built in the 8th century. Here, we stand in the very cornerstone of Coventry's local history.
The original nunnery may have fell to the Vikings, but with its re-establishment into a monastery under Earl Leofric and Lady Godiva, it became a place of worship, politics and conflict. St Mary's stood as both a symbol of faith and a valuable prize in the contest of power and piety.
After the Vikings destroyed the original nunnery in 1016, this site lay diminished, until Earl Leofric and his wife, Lady Godiva, endowed this monastery in 1043.
Almost from the start, this new monastery, despite its spiritual purpose, became a centre of power and commerce. It was granted land in Warwickshire, Leicestershire and beyond. Furthermore, the monastery was granted privileges to lord over these lands. That meant that money and obedience were now expected to the monks who lived there.
The monks who founded this monastery were followers of St Benedict of Nursia. And what St Benedict did was create a new rule set for monastic orders like this, which supplanted the ascetic, really hard Celtic Irish rule book which had existed up to that point. And a key part of that was a vow of locality. The monks here weren't just passing through, they were loyal to Coventry, they were of Coventry, and to quite a significant extent they were Coventry, because the life in the city was so closely tied to the economic output and spiritual influence of this location. The Benedictine order, if we can call it that, had no central hierarchy. Each monastery was independent. And that means that this one here, although it was affiliated with the Catholic Church, wasn't following direct rules being sent to them by the Pope or by a central monastic hierarchy. They were instead a part of this community, and they were responding to the community's needs and the land and the opportunities it gave them. In fact, by the time this monastery was founded, orders like this were probably the dominant ones across most, if not all, of Western Europe.
With the passing of Earl Leofric and Lady Godiva, the Priory lost its two most powerful allies. As a result, the next 500 years were marked by a power struggle as much as they were by faith and prayer. In 1135 saw the death of King Henry I. Conflict sparked between his nephew, Stephen of Blois, and his daughter, Empress Matilda. A kingdom divided, nobility emboldened. Soon, England collapsed into feudal chaos.
By the 12th century, the Priory had grown in stature, owing to Coventry's booming economy and successful woolen trade. The city was on its rise. In the centre, a towering church, a place of worship, prayer and learning. But faith couldn't save Coventry from the fury of civil war.
Robert Marmion, the Lord of Tamworth, was an aggressive ally of King Stephen. In the contested Midlands, Marmion made his stand in Coventry, where he did the unthinkable. He expelled the monks of St Mary's Priory and converted the cathedral into a fortress. He dug defensive ditches through the cloisters, erected barricades within the church, and stationed men where monks once stood.
Within the ensuing battle, Marmion met his fate. Riding through the very ditch he had ordered dug, Marmion's horse lost footing. The Baron fell, and before he could recover, he was cut down by a common foot soldier. Writers later in the century saw Marmion's fate as divine retribution for his sacrilege. The Lord, who is not to be mocked, permitted the same man who had polluted the sacred place to fall into the very pit his impiety had prepared.
Now, whilst the monks did return to the cathedral after Marmion's death, the scars remained. A place once dedicated to devotion and worship became victim to the highest sins of war.
For the 2 centuries following Lady Godiva's death, St Mary's had to deal with the constant conflict of their local bishops. One such bishop was Hugh de Nonan. Nonan was no ordinary cleric. Trained in diplomacy, fluent in canon law, and well connected at court, he served King Richard and later John with sharp political instinct. He held office as both the bishop and sheriff. He ruled not only the souls of Warwickshire, but its jails and courts. Nonan saw the Benedictine monks of St Mary's as an obstacle. To him, they were outdated and disobedient. He envisioned an order that followed the words of the bishop.
Nonan eventually grew tired of them. He stormed the precincts of St Mary's. Monks fled or were dragged out, records seized, property damaged, and the bishop, it is said, was injured during the scuffle. Armed with the authority of the Pope and the King, Nonan consumed the priory.
The tides turned with the election of Pope Innocent III. Seeking reform, he ordered the restoration of the monks of Coventry. The Benedictine chapter was reinstated, and Bishop Hugh de Nonan was stripped of his authority and shamed before Rome.
Nonan retired to Bec Abbey, Normandy, clothed in a Benedictine habit. On his deathbed, he confessed a lifetime of sins so grave that no priest was willing to absolve him. He saw the church not as a sanctuary of silence, but a tool of authority.
As the professor Peter Koss explains, whilst the relationship between the monastery and the bishops was genuinely bad in the 12th century, due in part to the bishops imposing control upon them and dividing the income from their estates, the situation did change. From the 13th century onwards, the monks returned and gradually recovered their authority. Upon the priory's endowment, Leofric and Godiva granted land to the monastery, splitting Coventry in 2, with the northern part of the city being granted to the monastery, becoming known as the prior's half.
The southern part remained under noble control, the Earl's half. This created 2 separate legal and economic zones within the city, leading to tension between the monks and the rising merchants of Coventry.
Whilst there was a fine balance between the two, the scales tipped in St Mary's favour, with the appointment of William Brightwalton as prior. Within a year, Brightwalton purchased the jurisdiction of the Earl's half. This did financially protect the priory for generations to come, but it laid down the gauntlet between the people of both halves of the city.
It took only 17 years for riots to commence against the priory's actions. In 1267, the priory acquired a licence for both the coroners and the merchants' guild, threatening a monopoly held in the Earl's half and thus threatening their livelihood. The ensuing riots and protests only cemented an animosity held between both halves for the next 80 years.
Tensions reached its height by the turn of the 14th century. The priory went on a legal rampage. It sued 67 people for boycotting their market due to it being held in priory lands. This included some influential figures such as John of Nottingham.
Only a few years later, John of Nottingham was a part of a group accused of besieging the priory and assaulting the stewards on the street. Mainly, they accused Nottingham of being a necromancer, attempting to rid the priory of the monks using dark magic. All charges were dropped, and debate has raged on if this was simply a ploy by the priory to legally attack their most fervent enemies. The priory's hold over Coventry started to falter. The noble lands of the Earl's Half were inherited by Queen Isabella. This swung the power back to the noble lands. It took just over a decade for the town to be seen economically as one. The acknowledgement of a whole separate town under prior influence had started to fade.
10 years later, the struggle for power between the two halves came to an end, with the tripartite indenture. This was a transition of rule from the noble powers of the Earl's half and the Cathedral of the Prior's half into the corporation.
When a line was drawn, and eventually it was neither the Prior nor the Earl who dominated Coventry. The merchant hierarchy, the oligarchy that ruled, that wished to become independent of any overlordship, they gradually got control of the city and there was a tripartite agreement and they became independent.
However, the cathedral wouldn't give up its power too easily. The lands under the cathedral itself were still acknowledged to be under priory influence, which due to its sheer size still came to about a quarter of all of Coventry.
The conflict between the priors and the Earl's half was the foundation of the city for nearly 300 years. The growth of the actual cathedral matched the growth of its influence over the city, both physically and economically.
From a simple priory to an economic powerhouse and one of England's largest cities, the priory grew, attaining over 1,500 acres of land. That's almost 1,000 football pitches. Now, this is due to the business know-how of successive bishops and their will to drive the cathedral to the higher echelons of power. So, do you find monasteries like this a place of power or piety?
I don't think there really is a difference between power and piety at its highest level in the medieval period. Because to be pious in a world in which heaven is real, in which the devil is real, in which purgatory is definitely real, and where life is short, often brutal, and frequently uncertain, is to put yourself in a position of power. So what's happening at this time is the monasteries, the priesthood are at the very top of society, right? It's not like how we have it now, where you've got the aristocracy or rich businessmen at the top, the middle class, the working class. It's the literal priesthood at the very top of society because they're praying for your soul. When you die, there's no guarantee you're not going to spend centuries, if not millennia, in purgatory before a decision is even made on whether you go to heaven or hell. Purgatory is an awful place to be as well. You don't want to be there. So what needs to happen is the priesthood, the monks, the nuns, they need to pray. They need to be putting grace out into the universe to help speed souls along to their eventual destination of heaven. And as that doctrine emerges and evolves over the course of the medieval period, places like this, places of piety and religious belief, become increasingly powerful because these are the places that essentially act as the gatekeepers of heaven.
Founded in the 12th century, St Mary's Priory grew into one of England's most powerful Benedictine houses. However, by the early 1500s, its influence was waning. Civic guilds and the city corporation overshadowed its authority. Records speak of fewer monks and rising debts, yet as a cathedral priory, St Mary's still carried national weight, sharing the right to elect bishops with Lichfield.
Though that counted for little in 1539, Henry VIII's second wave of dissolutions targeted England's great monasteries. Royal commissioners came to Coventry. Prior Thomas Camswell and his shrunken community of monks were compelled to sign away their house. The Crown seized lands and treasure, the monks departed with small pensions, and with the stroke of a pen, Coventry ceased to be a cathedral city.
Destruction followed swiftly. By 1545, the site was sold to John Hales. Unable to meet the high price, city leaders had to let the cathedral go. Its stones were scavenged and reused across Coventry. The chronicler Dugdale mourned. The glory of all these parts pulled in pieces and reduced to rubble.
To remember that tower was standing all the way into the 17th century on its four piers, and on the top of it, they used the top of the tower to put a water tank to feed the most prosperous houses who could afford to pay for a supply of water by lead pipe.
The city, once a powerhouse of sacred and civic authority, was left politically weakened and spiritually redirected.
Though only fragments remain, undercrofts and scattered stones, St Mary's endures in memory. A vanished cathedral, symbol of medieval splendour lost to Tudor reform.